Data centers. We're hearing more about them. We're seeing more of them being proposed across rural America, and there's plenty of debate over whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Well, today, Tony Pipa with the Brookings Institution joins me to help us understand what's driving this and what rural communities need to be thinking about.
And so people will say, we want that artificial intelligence to reflect Western values of freedom and openness and respect for the individual. And there are worries amongst policymakers that if another country is the one trading that artificial intelligence, that they might be trading it for other purposes.
But just because there's urgency doesn't mean communities shouldn't be asking some hard questions before saying yes.
So one, I think communities have more leverage than they realize. If someone's coming in and inquiring about a proposal, that's because they think that there's the right combination for that site to actually be really viable. And it's not like you can just put a data center anywhere.
The opportunities, the concerns, and the questions we ought to be asking about data centers. That's on today's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Oh man, the subject of data centers, it's a hot topic all across the country, and that is our focus on today's program of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Hi, everyone. I'm Justin Mills, your host. Good to have you with us on our program here today. And by the way, if you're listening, have to step away from the radio for unforeseen reasons, you can catch all of our programs by going to our site at workingranchradio.com, or if you have a preferred podcast provider, you can find all of our programs there. You can click and download that, listen to it when you're out of coverage, if you have to be out for doing something like that. And of course, you can catch all of our previous shows. Last week, we talked with Clint Berry. Something feels different in the cattle market was the topic of our discussion last week with Clint. Go back and listen to that one. Ahead of that one, we talked with Dr. David Lahman about when protein pays. And that was kind of a show directed at just how we handle our livestock in drought situations. So a great program there. Some other ones that you can go back and listen to as well. By the way, leave us a rating or a review. That's very helpful, not only for us, but for other folks that are searching and wanting to watch and listen to different episodes. Well, the next issue of Working Ranch Magazine will be coming to your door here shortly. And if you don't have a subscription, you can get one started by going to workingranchmag.com, and you can start your subscription today. Or it's as easy as stopping by your local Tractor Supply store and picking one up there right off the shelf. And a shout out to the Tractor Supply store in Okeechobee, Florida, in Ontario, Oregon, in Pagosa Springs, Colorado, and in Palestine, Texas. Hey, here's what we're working on for the upcoming edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Not sure if I'll get it put together or not, but what I'm working on is getting a couple very well-known ranch operations to join us as we talk on this subject. Here's the title: Are we breeding cattle for what we want from the calf while still building the cow that the ranch needs? Kind of a pretty in-depth, complicated question, but hoping to have a couple different guests on to join us to expand on that and give their thoughts. I think it'd be a very relevant topic for a lot of us, especially as we look ahead in hopes that we don't have a drought in future years and knowing that we're going to see some element of herd expansion across our country. Well, let's get into our subject at hand here today. And joining us on the program is Tony Pipa. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And Tony, good to have you here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to this conversation.
Well, ironically, it seems like this year it's becoming even more of an issue as we talk about data centers, probably because it's an election year, partly that and several other aspects, and it becomes a big topic in the circles, whether it's at debates or whether it's different things that are going on. At the same time, we continue to see more and more build out of that infrastructure that's taking place all across the country. And I think before we start, I want to make sure folks know that, our goal today really isn't to convince people one way or the others on whether data centers are good or bad, because the reality is they're becoming a part of our world. As you and I were talking before we started, we're not going to sit here and dilly-dally around and have a long conversation about whether you absolutely do not want them or not. They are going to happen. And before rural communities then decide about how they feel about them, I think it's important that we need to understand, first of all, as we're going to go through here today, what they are, why they're being built, What benefits can they bring? And then at the same time, what are some very legitimate concerns that they do raise? And so that's kind of the outline of our conversation here today. As we start with this, I feel it's interesting. As I mentioned a bit ago, I see it coming up a lot of times. And I was at a listening session a while back, and somebody stood up and said, they didn't want data centers. At the same time, they have a cell phone on their hip. and I thought there was a little irony in that. So not to ridicule anybody, but let's start with understanding data centers and why they matter. And let's just start from ground one with this. And for those that have not thought about it, what exactly is a data center?
Yeah, it is great starting point. So that word data is doing a lot of work when we say data center, right? Because the things that we do on our phones, the things that we do on our computers are transfers of data and there's data being housed. So data centers from the outside will look like a warehouse or maybe a factory, a large industrial building. Inside that building is going to be just rows and rows and rows and rows of computers that are servers or otherwise. And they will do everything from host data. So those photos that you take on your phone and then you're putting in the cloud, well, they need a place to go and to be hosted. So a data center is going to be a place that has the space and the technology and the hardware that's actually hosting all of the data that's behind those photos that make up those photos. And that means your healthcare data that the hospital has. That means the data that Amazon has of all your purchases and what Amazon is actually showing when you're going to shop. All of that is data and it needs a place to be hosted. Now, we're also entering an era where we are relying more on computers to help us even figure things out, right? And to run processes that are doing computations for us or are doing research for us. Artificial intelligence have been training computers to look at big blocks of text and then look at patterns out of that text and try to help us with understanding. And they do that computationally with large sets of data and numbers as well. So we need computing power to be able to run those particular processes, to train the computers to access all of that data. And so more and more, we're needing more and more infrastructure to be able to do that. So the thing is to think of data centers as the piece of physical infrastructure that lies underneath all the things that you're able to do on your phone, all the questions that you're able to ask those search engines like Google, and to be making sure that the photos that you take and the financial information that you have and the shopping that you're doing is all connected through the internet. That's the physical infrastructure for it. Mm-hmm. And actually having it proximate to places of business or to the people that are using it can be helpful as well, because it can reduce the lag depending on what that particular data center is being used for.
Tony, why have we seen this conversation? I think you can even go back to almost Clinton era, when technology, as I was reading in one of your guys' white papers about just the desire for the government to encourage technology development. So we can go clear back to almost that to now today, but it's been kind of on the low radar of nothing. Then all of the sudden we just boom. And I mean, we just skyrocketed with this conversation. What's propelled that? I mean, I'm guessing AI technology to some extent, but is that the main driver?
It is the main driver of what's propelled the conversation to the level that it's at right now. So we've had data centers for a long time. Mm-hmm. Like we've been storing our photos in the cloud for a long time, right? And I can look at rural communities in the Pacific Northwest, for example, like Quincy, Washington, or Prineville, Oregon. You know, they've had data centers for 15, 20 years hosted in their communities. And they've been primarily cloud servers for the data, like they've been hosting data that you post up into the cloud. But with the advent of artificial intelligence and, as I said, training computers to be able to go through all of this information and then give it back to us in a way that's really useful to us, and to do that efficiently requires a lot of computing power, right? And so immediately, we've gone from campuses that are a certain size of data centers to now what we're even calling hyperscale. So they're exponentially bigger That means they use more power, they use more water, they need more land, so they're a lot larger. And at the same time, there's a race within the market because the big tech firms and others, they want to be out in front of their competitors. So they feel like we need this amount of compute power to be able to stay in front as we're innovating and we're developing this new technology and this new artificial intelligence. So there's a market competition going on, and then there's a competition geopolitically going on as well. The technology sector is a big part of the United States economy and a big part of the future United States economy. And so if we're going to remain economically competitive and viable as a country, we want to be at the leading edge of that race. And so many policymakers where I'm at in Washington, D.C. would say, we're in a race with China. We've got to win this race, not only for the good of our economy, but also because we want artificial intelligence to reflect the values that we have as a country rather than the values that might come with another country. So you have seen an immense amount of spending. So first off, the market is acting with a real sense of urgency, and the spending has exponentially increased in a very short amount of time. We're looking at about almost, from the big tech firms, almost $700 billion of investment in this year alone around data centers, and potentially up to $5 trillion by 2030. And that is just an explosion of capital expenditure that blows out of the water what came before it. And at the same time as the speed at which the market is trying to move, these data centers are much bigger because they require so much more computing power to train the artificial intelligence that they're seeking to innovate on. If you're in a rural community, what seemed like fairly big, but was going to be something that you might get used to, now it's 4 to 5 times the size of that. I have a friend who does a presentation that takes a data center that's actually being built in Louisiana and superimposes it on the island of Manhattan. And it takes up 2/3 of the island of Manhattan. Like, that's the size we're talking about. So then people start asking different questions. And because it's happening all at once across the country, all of a sudden it becomes a much bigger part of the conversation and much part of the policy discourse.
Yeah, that conversation has absolutely just become a major, major conversation in so many things. Tony, before we go to break, I don't want to spend a lot more time on this, but you mentioned something and it caught my attention. You said there's a speed race between countries because you want it to reflect the values of your country. Can you just expand briefly on that? Because that's something you said, and I think we need to understand that.
Well, geopolitically, right, if I'm a policymaker and I'm looking at our national security, looking through the lens of national security, and I'm seeing countries that are trying to develop artificial intelligence, the question then becomes for me, what are they going to use that artificial intelligence for? Is that going to be for something that is good for all people, or might they be using it for surveillance, or might they be using it to cybercrime or things like that? And so we want to be in the lead because once that artificial intelligence is trained, it's going to train future artificial intelligence. And so people will say, we want that artificial intelligence to reflect Western values of freedom and openness and respect for the individual. And there are worries amongst policymakers that if another country is the one trading that artificial intelligence, that they might be training it for other purposes.
Yeah. Something I hadn't thought through. So I thought that was interesting. I want to make sure and point that out. So we're going to take a break here. And as we look into the next segment that we're going to talk about, so if data centers are becoming a part of our future, the next question is what do they mean for the communities that they're built in? And I want to talk about that as we come back, okay? Agoro Carbon works with farmers and ranchers to implement practices that promote soil health and add a new revenue stream. Now, when you work with Agoro Carbon, you'll gain a partner that provides flexible payments and local agronomic expertise for your row crop or your range or even your pasture operations. Partnering with Agoro Carbon is an investment in your land and your ranch's future. Get started today at agorocarbon.com. All right, so Tony, in the last segment, gave us sort of the breakdown, the basics of data centers and how that's all coming about. And as we left into break, we talked about they are coming. They are here. We've already seen them for actually a number of years. It's just definitely as we as a society continue to ramp up our use of data, we continue to see it more and more. I want to start talking about what this means, though, for local communities, both good and bad. I don't want to, necessarily paint this as a rosy picture and like, hey, this is because they're coming, it's all roses and rainbows. That's not the point. So my question is this: why would a rural community actually want a data center?
Yeah. So rural communities throughout our history have been the home for a lot of industrial development, right? They have minerals, they have natural resources, they have land, they have space. And so in some respects, that's a lot of the reason why you're starting to see data centers show up in rural communities. I talked about how large these particular data centers are for artificial intelligence. And so rural areas have that amount of space and amount of land. When I talk to county commissioners in a rural place, they will tell me, look, it would be irresponsible for me not to entertain a proposal from a developer looking at a data center. A lot of rural communities are operating under really tight budgets. Those budgets are tight because they've seen some business decline or they might have seen some industry leave. And so they're really living off of sort of residential property tax, which gives them a very fine, thin margin. Data centers potentially could bring significant tax revenue into a budget. Local budgets for municipalities, local budgets for school boards, for school systems, they need energy and they also need water. So you could imagine potential upgrades in infrastructure that could come along with data centers as part of a deal that a locality would negotiate. Now, they take up a lot of space, and from the outside, they might look like a manufacturing plant. And so if you're a local official, you might think, oh, we're going to put this large building on all this space. That's going to be a lot of jobs. There's actually not many jobs on a permanent basis. It's filled with computers, not people, right? So you got to think of, it's the computers in there. Those banks of computers would be the 3,000 jobs that might have been in a manufacturing plant. But there will be some jobs. Mm-hmm. People have to continue to upkeep the compute. And there's things like security and maintenance. There are jobs in the short term because you need to build, right? So you need construction. You'll have trades jobs. There will be infrastructure. Frankly, it will stress the infrastructure like local roads and things like that. And so there's also going to be jobs. And certainly when you have a lot of that construction activity going on, that could mean economic activity and revenue for local businesses on a whole host of things, everything from food and restaurants to just shopping and housing, hotels, whatever, all of that. There's a saying in the whole rural business, you see one rural community, you see one rural community, right? So you've seen one data center, you've seen one data center. It all depends on the deal. It's all about, if it's good for the community, that's because there's a deal that makes sense from the point of the community's energy and its energy infrastructure, the community's water, its water infrastructure, the use of that land and where that land is. There are things like there's some noise, there's some light pollution. You need redundant energy. So it depends on how they're thinking of what the redundant energy. I know one community in West Virginia where the secondary power is going to be diesel, and they just do not think that it's a good idea to have 10 million gallons of diesel like less than a mile from their watershed. They just see that as a risk. So it's all about balancing the risks and the potential benefits. You want to mitigate the risks to the extent possible, and you want to maximize the potential benefits. What's difficult, and I think why you're seeing even a political conversation around this, is that the speed at which the industry wants to move. Yeah. It makes it really hard for communities to sift through all those different dimensions that I just put out there. And they want to make sure that they're benefiting. I mean, I think that's the bottom line. A community needs to make sure that it's getting the proportional benefit off of a data center that makes sense for them, and that they're able to even think about it. What does it mean for their own economic future? Not just in the data center. It's kind of like an economic development strategy or a package. And how does that all fit together?
Mm-hmm. I want to go back and hit on a couple things that you mentioned and you brought up. I want to go back to jobs really quick because people say, well, it's going to create jobs. Yes, the initial build out, much like what we've seen in some of these rural states that have done wind or solar power, the initial build out has a lot of jobs. If you've got a small community, and let's say it took 1,500 people to build the plant or build the data center, and now it's only taken 100 people to operate it, that's still quite a few jobs.
Yeah. People think, well, it's a tech installation, right? Mm-hmm. It's an installation, that's technology. And so those are going to be kind of like tech jobs and they're going to be high paying. Well, there's a few of those, right? But a lot of the jobs are maintenance, keep the lights on jobs and make sure that the building and the cooling is working. And then there's security as well. And so the quality of jobs also becomes a question. That can be a point of negotiation with the developer and with the customer, right? The hyperscales as well, like those construction jobs may be around for a while. You just don't build the size of these things overnight. And so I've seen some proposals where the build out's like a 10-year build out as well. Okay. And so the question I also think on jobs though is who's filling those jobs, right? And if you're going to get underway on a construction project, are you going to be able to get your local people into those construction jobs? Have you got the training? Have you got what the folks are going to need? And is there even a negotiation to have with the developer on that? Because there's going to be certain specifications and certain things that are necessary. They're going to feel comfortable bringing in folks from the outside. And it can look like there's a lot of jobs, but not a lot of jobs actually going to the people who are in those particular communities. Those jobs coming from the outside and being imported, that can be okay in some respects because it does create economic activity, right? Creates economic opportunity. And that means, well, if I'm not working down building the data center, but now I've got a lot of people coming into the restaurant, I can hire more people, I can do bigger business. So there are these ripple effects, but it also brings pressures, right? Like a lot of rural communities don't have a lot of housing right now. And so where are all those folks going to stay? And can we make that a positive thing rather than a negative thing, right? It doesn't become like temporary housing that comes and goes, or people are coming in and pushing other people who are already in town out of their housing in some way because prices are getting jacked up and things like that. You know, it's complicated. It can be really good. Again, it comes back to, I think my bottom line is, it's kind of the deal itself and how prepared you are to be able to ensure that you're investing in the right things for where your community is at to actually make this the best thing possible for your community.
Yeah. Let's take another break here. Tony, when we come back, I want to specifically talk about water and electricity. Okay. That's definitely things that we hear a lot about, especially from the rural areas. And I mean, some electricity to some standpoint, but water, especially those that are needing in farming areas. So I want to talk about that when we come back.
Capitalize on crossbreeding with Gelbvieh and Balancer bulls. Raise replacement females with added fertility, increased longevity, and greater productivity. Gelbvieh and Balancer influence females wean more pounds of calf per cow exposed. In the feed yard, Balancer influenced cattle offer increased performance, improved feed efficiency, and have excellent carcass merit. Balancers add the pounds, make the grade, and deliver the value. This year, make your crossbreeding count with Gelbvieh and Balancer genetics.
Welcome back. My guest today is Tony Pipa. He is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute as we are talking on data centers. And again, folks, if you're just catching the conversation, keep in mind, it's not a conversation here today to try to persuade you yes or no on it, other than just informational standpoint and thinking through this process. We've already had great discussion so far. And Tony, when we left in the last break, I mentioned that I want to specifically talk about water and electricity, because those are definitely two things that come up. And actually, there's a third thing. In fact, I was just reading a state legislator here in the state talking about land, and that would be kind of the third thing. However, when I get to land and some of this kind of stuff, you know, if you're a private property individual and you want to sell your land to a data center, I mean, I believe in private property rights. So to me, land is, yes, I can see some issues with land, but at the same time, as a private property advocate, man, if you want to do that, that's up to you. Now, the resources go back to electricity and water, which is, to me, bigger issues. So let's talk through that process with water and electricity. Are those concerns justified? And what does the reality look like when we look at those two aspects?
So let's just start with electricity. You need a lot of electricity to power the data center. And the electricity has to be really dependable. Like, my understanding is that even if you have a blip, a second blip or whatever, that can be really detrimental to the business of what the data is doing. And so you need redundant energy as well. So that's going to create pressure for getting the energy, the electricity delivered. In some places, there's been some studies that suggest that rates are getting passed off to local homeowners or other businesses rather than the new data center coming in proportionally just taking on its rates. And that became a big political conversation. And you even saw the president in his State of the Union have commitments from some of the big tech firms to say, data centers, we all pledge to make sure that whatever data centers we put in are not increasing rates, electrical rates. Mm-hmm. It is going to stress the infrastructure. We don't have enough electrical infrastructure in the country right now to sort of service the big surge in data centers that's planned. And so that means we're going to have to build more infrastructure. And it also asks the questions, where that energy come from? How are we going to create that electricity? I mentioned just when we were talking before about how one of the data centers that I'm familiar with in West Virginia is thinking of a diesel backup. At the same time, they're also planning to build like an immense solar farm to be able to power that particular data center. The energy also comes into play on the cooling systems. So you got to keep the chips cool to be able to work. So all those computers that are whirring inside that warehouse and doing what they're doing, whether they're storing data or they're training an artificial intelligence language model or whatever, if they overheat, they're going to be no good. They're going to burn out. And so that's where you need electricity to run a cooling system. And that's where you also need the water, right? The water is a coolant. Now, there's been a lot of improvements in technology, even rapid improvements in technology on the coolant side. And you're seeing more and more, especially of the large tech players, go to what's called a closed loop system, where they're just recycling the water all the way through rather than taking brand new water and cooling it and then taking brand new water out of the ground and using that for coolant. So they're sort of starting with a level of water and recycling it over and over and augmenting it incrementally. Having said that, my understanding from a closed loop system is it actually needs more energy because you're needing to recycle the water and you need the energy to do that. So you've got this balance between the energy and the water. It's interesting to see data centers go up in a place like Arizona where it's really hot. So you need to make it really cool, right? And they have very little water. But again, I think the industry would say, well, we're innovating and we're creating the way to make sure that we're doing this as sustainably as possible and with as little resources as possible. And frankly, it's within their incentives to do that, right? They're going to want whatever systems they put in place as they evolve to be as efficient as possible. Mm-hmm. Around land, I think what I would say is, especially with a hyperscale data center, you're taking a lot of land out of service. No longer going to be able to ranch that land. Your cattle aren't going to graze on it, or you're not going to be planting on it. All fine, well and good. You want to sell that, and that happens. Having said that, there is a little bit of a more opinion than fact because you can't really predict the future. But there is a risk. There's a risk that the technology on the chips becomes so good and that the way in which artificial intelligence processes itself becomes so efficient that we actually won't need the entire build out. Think back to the railroad system. We kind of overbuilt railroads in the beginning. We built all this industrial development, then it didn't get used. And so you can see where there are risks from a policy perspective if you're a local elected official to say, well, what happens? You build this big thing, we've got it right in the middle of our jurisdiction, and then all of a sudden you're not using it. We're not getting the tax revenue from it. It's just sitting there, and then what are we going to do with it kind of thing? That's part of where I think the land use conversation comes into play.
Yeah, good point there. Should agriculture look at this as a threat?
Well, I think you want to ensure that there's a lot of transparency around what the use of those natural resources are going to be. How much water is going to be needed for this particular center and this particular system? How much energy is going to be needed for this particular system, given the infrastructure that we have? And how might that affect the surrounding area that might be primarily agriculture that we depend on water at this level for and that we depend on our own energy at this level for? It is a question that needs to be asked, and it needs to be answered with as much clarity and transparency as possible. And then it's up for, I think, the community to decide whether that's tenable or that's not, whether the revenue might come along with it is useful or whether it endangers a local economy that's basically agricultural.
Yeah. All right, let's take one more break. And as we wrap up our conversation in this next break, I want to start it with just having this discussion, looking if we can ahead and before we see unintended consequences that could maybe be hurtful, just maybe recognizing those now. And I want to have that discussion when we come back, okay?
Sure.
A high-functioning rumen drives herd performance, gut health, and profitability. Levucel SC by Lalaman Animal Nutrition is the only natural occurring rumen-specific active dry yeast probiotic selected to optimize rumen function, boost fiber digestion, and help you get more out of your forage and feed. No matter how you supplement your herd, including Levucel SC can help your cows do more on what they already have. Discover the right formulation for your herd at chooselevucelsc.com.
All right, Tony, as we wrap up our conversation and talking about this, we've been able to kind of get a lot of different dialogue in this that I think gives a good understanding of where data centers are at, how they're being built out, its effect in energy and water and land and those kinds of things. And I think with anything, as we look ahead in this, we try to learn from previous mistakes in our society when we've seen whether it's a land rush or the booms of the oil fields and various things like that. And we look at this and say, okay, as we look at this boom cycle happening with data centers, how do we do this so that we don't have to deal with some unintended consequences? And something that I know you guys have spent really a lot trying to think through as well. So when I use that phrase in terms of unintended consequences and looking ahead and picturing you maybe 20 years and looking in the rearview mirror, what's the thoughts that you think about?
Yeah. So I do start from even the beginning. So I think a community needs to be involved and engaged in this conversation from the very beginning. So one of the things that I probably should have mentioned and neglected to mention when we were talking at the very top of the show about how fast this is happening, the speed with which this is happening is also complicated by the fact that many times developers are coming in and asking to have confidential conversations with their local officials because they feel like, their business interests or things like that they don't want to be public. That has the effect of then 2 or 3 people locally being a part of the conversation and then presenting something at the very end to the community. From my perspective, you want all of the dimensions that we've talked about up to now. I think you want everybody to be involved in that conversation. This is actually exactly what our democracy was set up to do, right? For local communities to come up and in a civic way, look at the pros and the cons and decide what's good for them and whether the proposal that's coming in from the outside sort of meets that. So I think there'll be a lot of unintended consequences if at the local level of how communities function, frankly, if data centers are being forced into places. And let's be honest, a lot of the companies and the developers, they have deep pockets and they have resources. Localities themselves don't necessarily have the access to engineering and legal expertise and financial expertise. And so it's a pretty asymmetrical negotiation. So I think it's really important that the community is involved in these conversations and given the chance to be thoughtful about if the siting makes sense, if the energy and the water needs all make sense. Mm-hmm. The second thing from my perspective is we set up commercial taxes for a reason. Right? Public safety, water, infrastructure, roads, clearing snow off the roads, all those things are necessary for there to be a functional business. So we want the revenue to be proportional to what communities need to make that work really well. And a lot of times data centers are getting tax abatements and things like that, and that's a way to attract them into a community. And instead of that steady revenue over a period of time, They'll be more like make a one-time payment. Let's say we'll set aside $20 million or $50 million for the local school system. And that sounds great, but behaviorally, my worry is that you take that $20 million, you got to make sure you're investing it for the long haul rather than just thinking of it as money that dropped out of the sky and, hey, we'll do that new football stadium, right? What are the investments we need to make in our educational curriculum and the services that we're providing to the kids? How do we make sure that we're getting proportionally what we need so that 20 years down the road, we've got the educational system that we really need and want. We've got the infrastructure that we need and want. We've got the public services that we need and want so that our place is a great place to live and work. And it's the place that we love that we're living in right now. And then I do think we've got to plan for risk. We've got to plan for potentially stranded assets. We got to plan for what do we do with all these chips if all of a sudden they're not needed anymore? How do we take care of all that? We should be setting some money aside for that rainy day and investing it now so that it's there if we need something in 15 years, because all of a sudden we're only going to use quarter of the campus that we built. And what do we do with that 3 other quarters? And what are the environmental impacts? We got to make sure that we're protecting the environment, whatever happens with the water runoff or whatever happens with those chips, or whatever happens with what we've built, even if they're solar panels, right? What happens with the solar panels when they wear out? What happens with the blades on the wind turbines if they go away? How are we planning for that future? I worry that this is happening in such a accelerated fashion that we got to put some sort of standards in place so that we're thinking along those lines and planning as much as possible for, we don't know what the world's going to look like in 20 years. So we got to make sure we're investing in a rainy day for the worst scenario that it might look like rather than the best scenario.
Mm-hmm. Question that I thought about is we have been talking about it coming to local communities, and there is some discussion that's taking place and actually disagreement probably within states themselves, because a community might be open to it, but the state may or may not, or the vision of how that's going to come about, because the resources, well, that stream or river or location might be local to that community.
Yeah.
There is effects downstream or in other areas. How do we handle that debate?
That's what makes us also quite complicated, because like, as you're saying, it's not just the effects on the local community itself. The effects go beyond the local community and could be like the entire watershed for a region or maybe even the state. But states are also competing against each other a little bit for this, right? They don't want to be left out of what looks like potential opportunity. And so they're creating policies around trying to make their areas look attractive. And so you've got negotiations going on between localities and states for those larger impacts, and you've got state to state as well. I think having a set of standards across all of these would be really helpful. I think as quickly as we're moving now, I think the supply chain is actually going to slow us down a bit. You can only add so much to power plants with the parts that we have. So you're going to have to build more parts and be able to do that. And so maybe that'll buy us a little time to just sort of figure out, okay, how to have some standards both across and within a state, as well as state to state. But it's a challenge right now. The extent to which localities are really stretched at the limits of their capacity to figure this out for what's good for them, states are stretched at the limits of their capacity as well right now. Even if I'm a volunteer mayor in a locality and I'm dealing with a data center proposal and I'm trying to think of like, what lawyer can I call and what engineer can I call and how do I get the expertise to know what's good, bad, and how do we read this thing? States are doing the same thing. And so they're trying to figure out, hey, we've got like 6 data center proposals in this region of the state. What's that going to mean for all the water there? Or what's that going to mean for the electrical company and the utility that's going to have to provide all the electricity there? It's intense right now, and I feel like I'm not giving you a good answer because I don't know if I have a great answer.
One thing I do hear in what you're saying, and it kind of reminds me of a story we learned in Sunday school. Now, it was more from your personal life, but the same thing would apply from this standpoint, is building your house on the sand or building your house on a rock. And kind of the foundation to how we go about this is probably going to be pretty instrumental to being able to look back in 20 years and say, oh, I wish we had not of, or I wish we would have. Final question here, and you've sort of addressed this a little bit, but just some final comments that you could leave listeners, that are ranchers, landowners, county commissioners, state leaders, community leaders. with advice as they look at these conversations? Are they in the driver's seat? Do we need to just sit back and let them come in? How do we handle all that? Just some final advice to folks that are listening, not only from those making decisions, but also those of us that are just consumers.
Yeah. So one, I think communities have more leverage than they realize. If someone's coming in and inquiring about a proposal, that's because they think that there's the right combination for that site to actually be really viable. And it's not like you can just put a data center anywhere, right? So you've got leverage to begin with. Secondly, I just feel like transparency from the very get-go can really reduce, and it may seem really messy. It's messy to have a large conversation and people with their differing opinions. But I think the investment of that kind of conversation up front is going to reap lots of dividends off the back end versus thinking, oh, we'll put all this together and then we'll just ask people, because that's a recipe, I think, for the community feeling really left out. And even if the data center goes forward, you're going to be dealing with a lot of resentment. Because the third thing I would say is be clear about what your interests are and the benefits that would be really good for your community. And you want to hear from a lot of your community and gather those ideas, right? And gather that buy-in. Because if you do want to make this a positive thing, I think everybody's got to see some benefit for their way of life and for their town and the place that they love. That's the other thing that I think the industry is starting to learn, is that those of us who know rural communities know that we're there because we love it, right? They're places to live and work, and we really value the quiet, the space, the different things, the community, the sense of community, and the knowing your neighbor, all of that. I think that's different than where they've been sort of setting up before. It's not just an economic, rational decision. It's a decision about, our community and its future. The fourth thing I would say is access the help you need, right? Figure out a way to get the help you need. And that maybe the state has folks that can help you out. Maybe there are other folks, but get access to the expertise that can really help you think about this in a way that you understand what the risks are for your particular situation. And you're also able to put in as strong a way as possible what the benefits could be and make sure that the developers are proportionally doing right by you.
Yeah. Well, as we leave our conversation here, a lot to think through, a lot to think about. You guys have a webpage, a lot of information on that. Yeah. I know you also, not only from this particular topic, but other things as well that deal with rural America. If folks are interested, the website, brookings.edu, but any more information on that?
My particular initiative is called Reimagining Rural Policy, and that's easy to find on the Brookings website. And in data centers in particular, there are more and more good resources out there. There's a couple of things that other people have written about, like the 10 things a public official ought to be asking about when a data center comes to call. There are going to be more and more resources out there, I think, for the communities to be able to think that through. And so take advantage of what's out there for sure.
You bet. Well, Tony, good to visit with you. Helpful for me as well. I've been one of these that's like, I know there's usefulness. I know there's value in what we got to do. I know it's coming, like it or lump it. It's the way it is. But how do we do this responsibly at the same time and be smart about it so that, as I said before, when we look 20 years down the road, we felt like we made the best decisions we could at the time. So,
yeah. The conversation, thanks for having me on, and look forward to further conversation about this. As you say, it's not going away. So we're all going to have to work through it, both in our local communities, at the states, and as a country as well.
You bet. Thanks, Tony. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
You bet. And our guest joining us here today, Tony Pipa with the Brookings Institute. And again, their website to follow along with some of the white paper information that they have on this particular subject. You can go to their website at brookings.edu. Well, stay with us. Meteorologist Don Day is in as we take a look at our long-range weather.
Fascinated by our wild weather? Now you can learn, appreciate, and understand the weather in your own backyard with the new Tropo Rain Gauge. Having achieved the highest rating of any product reviewed by the weatherstationexperts.com, the Tropo boasts rugged durability, impeccable accuracy, and precision to the hundredth of an inch. Visit measurerain.com to order a Tropo today and use code RAINDAY. That's RAINDAY for free shipping and 10% off. Go to measurerain.com.
Today's Long Range Weather brought to you by Long Range Cattle Dewormer with epinephrine, giving you 150 days of parasite protection in just one single dose, helping your herd stay out grazing, gaining weight without that extra parasite pressure. To find out more, you can go to their website at longrangedewormer.com. And joining us now with our Long Range Weather is meteorologist Don Day. And Don, we have seen in the past several weeks not only the extreme heat, but there has been some monsoon flow of moisture up through portions of the country that has definitely needed it. It's been a little hit and miss in some areas, but there's definitely been that flash of moisture that comes up. As you look and we start getting into August, what are you anticipating that to look like, as we see and how it's going to affect the rest of the country?
Well, at least for the beginning of August, we're going to see that monsoonal moisture take a pause, especially for the desert Southwest and parts of the central and southern Rockies, where you mentioned it. There's been some help in many areas. There's been some many areas where it's been less productive and a little bit more spotty, although that's the nature of the beast of the monsoonal moisture flow. Arizona, western New Mexico, I would say, are the two areas where we could look at and say, wow, the moisture was very beneficial. Parts of western Colorado as well, although it's interesting. You look at like southwest Colorado, they did great in many areas. Northwest Colorado didn't. And you'll get that with the monsoon pattern. However, that spigot of moisture is going to get deflected and it will stay in Mexico and Central America into the early, let's say the first week to 10 days of August. So that part of the country is going to see some drier, hotter conditions, while we'll see the better rain chances get more along the southern tier of the U.S., the southeast U.S., parts of the mid-Atlantic, the Ohio Valley. We will see some needed rain get into the northwest Corn Belt. Unfortunately for the Pacific Northwest, Washington, Oregon, Northern California, Idaho, that's where the wildfire activity now has gone to, is that northwest part of the country. They're going to stay hot and dry.
Mm-hmm. When we look at this extreme heat that we've seen across portions of the country, where it's been almost several weeks in a row, that's not something we've seen on a normal basis throughout the years. Anything that correlates to, or that you would just throw your input on, not only the extreme heat, but just the longevity of it?
Yeah, no, it's definitely had staying power, but every summer in North America, there's a high that sets up across the continent. And a lot of times it can be centered in the Corn Belt, it could be centered in the Southern Plains, or it could be centered in the Northern and Central Plains. And you do have, that's where you get the extended week on end periods of hot weather. This year it's been located more west. And actually, if you look at the edges of the country, California and then a lot of the East Coast, they've actually had, on whole so far, a pretty average or even a cooler than average summer. You haven't heard about a California heat wave, have you? That's because the heat wave's been centered over the middle part of the country. So in the sense of, is that unusual? Well, it depends on, where the high wants to be. You could go back certainly to the 1930s if you want to have some comparisons. And the 30s were famous for multiple summers in a row like that. So a little unusual. Yeah, I think little unusual in the sense of where it's wanted to be this summer. But I can tell you every summer there's a place like what the Central and Northern Plains have seen. It's just not there. It's somewhere else.
Yeah. Okay. All right, let's talk about El Nino and get an update on that, because one of the things I know last week in your podcast, you were talking about the fact that definitely it's there. You're seeing that as you graph that out, though. But talk about your interpretation of the El Nino, the data that you're looking at.
So, right now, the reminder to people is that for North America and most of the folks listening to this is that the impacts come fall, winter, and spring. So, during the course of the summer, North American summer, you will see some of the bigger El Nino impacts in South America. Like they've had very heavy rain flooding in Chile, huge amounts of snows in the Andes. And that's where during this time of year, the El Nino is going to show its impacts. Our cold season is when it comes in. So we're not even in the point yet where we can really start talking about El Nino impacting North American weather. With that said, when we measure the sea surface temperatures in the Pacific, we see that they're nearly 2 degrees Celsius above the average, which puts it into very strong El Nino status. And right now, the status of El Nino and how it's tracking with the modeling is right in the middle. It's right in the middle of where El Nino is predicted to be. And right now, it's not tracking at the upper levels of the extremes that some people have been talking about this summer. Like, oh my gosh, it's going to be a 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, El Nino. Certainly, it's got room to grow and get stronger. But this is one thing that I think folks missed and are going to continue to miss is that the Pacific Ocean in an El Nino tends to see an increase in tropical storm, hurricanes, and typhoons. Those stir up the water and can cool the water off. So when we look at the modeling for El Ninos, they may not account for the increase in hurricanes, which have a cooling effect on the waters. So yes, we've got the El Nino. Yes, it's going to be very strong. But right now, it's not tracking at the extreme levels that some folks are predicting. Now, that could change. But I think one reason for that is we're seeing a lot of activity in the Pacific. We will through August, September, and October. And watch that because I do think El Nino will enhance the hurricanes that could affect Central America, Mexico, and even the parts of the Western United States as we go forward.
All right. So we won't go into detail here, and we'll save this for another show. But with what you had said, that we don't really see some of these effects until fall, winter, and spring, this coming winter going to look a little different than the last couple?
Sure does. It sure should. It does look like this winter the variables are a different set of variables. There's some similar ones to last year that you and I can talk about when we get into the winter forecast, but it's a different animal this winter. And there's a lot happening. So this winter could end up being a very interesting one across the North American continent. And the big reason for that is it's a different setup. It's a different setup than last winter.
All right. Well, Don, appreciate the update, and we'll check in with you next week.
See you then.
And that was meteorologist Don Day with a look at our long-range weather. You can tune in each and every morning. Follow along with him on his daily video podcast. You can find the link to that by going to his website at dayweather.com.
Imagine keeping your cattle exactly where you want them while being able to tap into insights powered by a collar and an app. No Fence is the world's first virtual fencing system for grazing livestock. From the palm of your hand and delivered with GPS technology, you can set and move pasture boundaries, gain insight into grazing patterns, receive reduced animal activity alerts, and more. No wires, no posts, just empowered grazing that supports healthier land and your herd goals. 10,000 plus producers globally already trust No Fence. Explore the possibilities at nofence.com.
Well, it's been a big summer for adding some major technology to our ranch management here on the X-Ring Ranch. Of course, the last few summers, we've been using Tank Toad for our remote water monitoring system, in addition to Barn Owl cameras so we can keep track of those remote tank locations. At the same time, then this summer, we added in a couple more things, and that was some virtual fence collars on one set of cows that are at the place up north about 30 miles away, in addition to GPS tags that are on all the bulls across both outfits. So a lot going on there, and we're excited to see how we can implement this as we move forward in our ranching operation. Well, we thank you for joining us here today on the program. The Working Ranch Radio Show is a production of Working Ranch Magazine, branded #1 by America's Ranchers. Thanks for joining us. I'm Justin Mills, and until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.